Welcome and thanks for joining us for part two of our discussion, Implementing an AI Plan, sponsored by Noblis. My guests today are Chris Barnett, the Chief Technology Officer at Noblis. Taka Ariga is the Chief Data Scientist and Director of the Innovation Lab at the Government Accountability Office. Rajiv Upal is the Chief Information Officer for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And Jesse Rowlands, the AI Strategic Officer at the Defense Logistics Agency. And let's begin, and I'd like to ask the federal guests here for a moment, what are some of the things you're actually thinking about in AI, or some projects that are promising underway, or maybe some recent deployments? Jesse, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot of work on DLA side with logistics, demand planning, supply chain, vendor reliability. And those projects are really important, but what's more important to me is setting up that AI ecosystem so we can get these projects through kind of an AI life cycle quickly. So for me, as the strategic officer, I'm really focusing on, do we have the data in place? Do we have the infrastructure and tools? Do we have the experts and the data scientists to facilitate these projects? And do we have that governance structure, right? When I speak of governance for AI, do we have the knowledge management? Do we have the risk mitigation? So setting up this kind of AI end-to-end ecosystem, so whatever project we want to take on in the future, we can get through that pipeline quickly, we can iterate, we can experiment, and we can learn, more importantly, on what we've done in the past.
And I imagine there are counterparts in industry, Walmarts or Costco's or those types of outfits that also have big, and again, large volume issues with supply base and getting things from point A to point B to where they need to be. Is that something you've looked at also to see what your industry counterparts are doing?
Yeah, it's definitely something we consider. I think one of the biggest differences is, when people compare us to Amazon or Walmart, it's the risk tolerance. If Walmart runs out of toilet paper, it's no biggie. If a warfighter runs out of a critical part, that's a different problem. And it's also the demand cycle. No one can really predict the demand of the defense industry per se. We don't know when we're going to get into engagement. We don't know specifically when we're going to, go to war. And so it's very important when we create these models, that we plan to mitigate that risk. So we've been training models on the past 20 years of data. Great. Does that past 20 years of data reflect what we think is going to be the future of conflict for us? So we have to be a lot more careful than these other logistics organizations. That may look like DLA, but the risk appetite is completely different.
Sure. I imagine, say, if the last 20 years in warfare was taking place in warm environments, and now we're out of the warm environment and it could be the cold environment, that would really make the data questionable, or at least raise the need to bring in more data related to whatever cold weather logistics needs there are. Is that a good way to summarize it?
Absolutely, yeah. And the platforms are changing, right? The location is changing. The way we conduct warfare is changing. So it's really hard to train and develop these models because they may look good, when you grade them, they're like, oh, they do great over the past 20 years, but, we're not fighting the Cold War anymore. Maybe we won't be fighting an insurgency in the future. So we really have to stress test these models. We really have to take into account the risk, using synthetic data, stressing these models, and most importantly, planning for when the model breaks or deteriorates.
And Rajiv, I guess in some ways, things are changing at CMS as the whole general model of repayment for health services shifts from the transactional basis to the outcomes type basis. And so what are some of the projects you have going in AI at CMS, and how are you choosing the data to make sure those are on track?
That's a great question, Tom. As you pointed out, there's definitely use of AI and within payment models, and the kinds of payment models that are used that we're trying with our innovation center at CMS. Besides that, AI is definitely used at CMS for fraud, waste, and abuse kind of applications. One of the other places we've been recently experimenting with AI, as you know, for all federal systems, before they can go to production, they have to go through an ATO process, or authority to operate. And that's a compliance process that takes a while, a few months, if not more, sometimes to get through it. And we've been using and experimenting with AI of how we can make that faster. How can we reduce the burden? So when people are documenting certain controls, is there a way for us to use natural language processing to look across our database of controls and say, hey, you're trying to, document this control. Here are some of the samples that AI can discover and provide a pathway to getting these things faster. So again, as I was speaking before, now how can we augment the humans so that the work that they're doing is faster and reduces some of the burden? So these are some of the use cases of AI. And as Jesse mentioned, there's a significant amount of effort in our infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I don't mean just the software and hardware infrastructure. It's also the human infrastructure, as we talked before. Significant investment into, we have a workforce upskilling program that we call Workforce Resilience, and we offer many tracks for our staff to get upskilled on human-centered design, which is an important component of how we do things. Data science track is also one of the other tracks that we offer, product management, and a few others. So again, how do we invest in our workforce so they have a better understanding of what AI is, so we can use appropriate technologies? Then beyond that, setting up the infrastructure, we're working on a platform, kind of like the platform that the Air Force has called Platform One. So CMS is working on something similar. So when people want to build systems and applications, they have a ready-made platform that they can work on that allows them to move things much faster. Similarly, on the data side, we have been working over the past year plus on a data lake, data mesh platform, so that when we talk about using data, and when you're at CMS, you're talking about, hey, can I get claims data, beneficiary data, of course, all that within the confines of privacy and security, but getting to the source of truth, making sure that we have a data lake and a data mesh that enables all that. So these are, sort of to Jesse's point, focusing on the infrastructure so that when we start using AI and models to be able to predict and help reduce burden, we have some of the underlying infrastructure taken care of.
All right. And before I get to Taka on some of what's going on in the Innovation Lab, I wanted to ask you, Chris, I hear a couple of themes here. One is really having a good foundation or ecosystem of the tools and the brain power and the processes in place before you deploy things. Mm-hmm. And the other is the idea of augmenting the human, augmenting the person, as opposed to, say, augmenting a process, where maybe that's the same thing. Is that what you hear? I mean, is that a good, looking across the agencies, it seems like these themes are pretty common.
They are. I think the setup of the infrastructure and the governance processes really transcends various agencies and departments. I mean, they want to have a good feel for whether it's the infrastructure piece or the software in place or the trained personnel, that we have an idea for how to deliver kind of that comprehensive service element. The thing we're seeing too is there's certainly a readiness to adopt and experiment across the various players. I think a lot of it comes down to, someone mentioned, I think, pilots earlier, getting a few base hits here and there on a few simple pilots, whether you're automating business processes, or maybe it's the automation of consumption of documents through natural language processing, et cetera, to really start augmenting the person's task, making their work easier, starting small and then branching out from there. We're also seeing a lot of willingness to share data sets with industry. And so that's helpful to us, certainly, because the training of the models, whether it's labeled or pre-labeled data, is critical. And, while we can generate our own, buy our own, et cetera, borrow, when we can work with a government partner that can provision data for us, it makes our job a lot easier to start building prototypes and getting the results faster. So, I mean, I think you're hearing a lot of themes here that I think are transcending all across the government space.
And Taka, before I ask you about the Innovation Lab, I just want to return to something that Jesse mentioned, and I know that's something that's near and dear to your heart, and that is the idea of synthetic data for training algorithms. What is that and how does it work? And then I want to hear about some of the AI things going on in the lab.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of using synthetic data is when a sort of empirical data set is not available, you can use synthetic data as an augmentation. So sometimes that is done through, let's say, missing data elements, or if there's elements of a bias that you're trying to mitigate, you could use synthetic data as a proxy to achieve the kind of performance that you're looking to attain. For us in an innovation lab, we have used a synthetic model to really demonstrate the impacts of different kinds of control on improper payments, so that different program office can calibrate based on fact and circumstances of their program. They can understand the trade-off decision. So it's not just about improper payments being prevented, but also proper payments being deterred. That is a sort of delicate balance. But for GAO, AI is a very good example of balancing act that we have to do between understanding the accountability challenges of emerging capabilities like AI, but also how do we ourselves adopt those sort of opportunities. So from an oversight, foresight, insight perspective, GAO has done a number of technology assessment looking at how AI is applied in healthcare setting, in drug discovery setting. We've done work looking into facial recognition technology, and we will continue to do these type of oversight, foresight, insight work. For the innovation lab, I talked about our sort of experimentation into natural language processing capabilities. We're developing a set of precedence paper because the way that GAO conducts our business is based on generally accepted government auditing standards. So that doesn't mean all techniques are appropriate. We certainly have a bias towards transparency, toward linearity, but want to make sure that our teams understand the appropriateness of those machine learning techniques in different contexts. And the another area that we're exploring is the intersection of cybersecurity versus AI. We talk about zero trust a lot, and usually those conversations focus on humans, but it's very easy to assign some sort of root credential to the AI that are running behind the scene. So how do we make sure that that zero trust extend to algorithms as well? And Rajiv touched on this. We certainly within GAO have a robust data science platform that speaks to the scalability, containerization, orchestration of AI solutions, but also making sure on the front end, we have a well-governed data sort of framework so that when we talk about machine learning, it's not garbage in, garbage out. And then the last piece I'll just add is we're also pushing through a data literacy function to make sure that our workforce, instead of a yes, no kind of binary discussion, what comes out of AI typically is probabilistic. So how do you interpret a 67% likelihood of something happening? How do you narrate that conversation within our oversight product? I think that's an important elements of absorptive function of AI that both Rajiv and Jesse talked about.
Yeah, so that idea of probabilistic outcomes feeds into the agency's need for risk management and how they apply technology, and that seemed to go hand in hand there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I talked about this touches on the procurement aspects as well, because it's you don't just go out and buy AI, right? You might develop products, you might develop services, you might have consulting and other industry partners to help you. But how do we think about procurement of AI? How do we think about, and the one aspect that we highlight this in the AI accountability framework is how do you deal with the continuous monitoring of AI? Because machine learning these days are still quite fragile. You can't just deploy it and forget it. How do we deal with data drift? How do we deal with model drift? And as we scale between, let's say, experimentation into a nationwide deployment, does the AI solution still function as intended? More often than not, there are unintended consequences, and then certainly there's plenty of intentional adversarial attack on AI. So I think all that is part of the enablement conversation.
All right, we're going to take a short break on that note. My guests today are Taka Ariga. He's the Chief Data Scientist and Director of the Innovation Lab at the Government Accountability Office. Chris Barnett is the Chief Technology Officer at Noblus. Jesse Rollins is the Strategic AI Officer at the Defense Logistics Agency. And Rajiv Upal is the Chief Information Officer for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I'm Tom Temin. This panel discussion is implementing an AI plan sponsored by Noblus here on Federal News Network.